Modern-day chess can trace its origins to the ancient Indian game of Chaturanga. It was first recorded around the 6th century AD. For today, I'm going to be showing you how to play modern chess. You want the board set up with the dark square on the bottom left corner. And to show you the different pieces, this is a castle, also known as a rook. And that goes on the bottom left and right corners, and also the top right and left corners. You want white on one side and black on the other side. This is a bishop, and the bishop will go right here and right here. So third square in from the left or third square in from the right on both the white side and the black side. This is the other bishop. Kings go on the right, and they are on the opposite square of the color that they're playing against. So for example, the white king is on the black square, and then the black king will be on the white square. This is a pawn, and the pawns will go all in the second row. This is a queen. The queen always goes right next to the king. So queens will also be facing each other. This is a knight, and the knights go right next to the rooks. As you can see, I already have a knight sitting right here. Once you have your board set up, you can choose to either move a pawn. For the first move, a pawn can move 2 spaces forward, or it can move 1 space forward. After that first move, the pawn can then only move 1 space at a time. The only difference with a pawn, the pawn can only go forwards unless, if I move this forward, if the opponent is diagonal from the pawn, then the pawn can capture the opponent. The other piece that can move at this time, besides the pawn, would be a knight. A knight will go in an L shape, so go up 1, 2, and then over 1, or it can also go up and over 1 this way. So again, to recap, pawns can move either 1 or 2 spaces forward, or a knight can move. That will be your first move, and white always goes first. So to start things off, I'm going to move my white pawn 2 spaces forward. Next, for black, I will move the knight. Now it's white's turn, and I'm going to move this pawn. If you notice, if I move this pawn 2 spaces forward, it is now being threatened by this knight, because the knight, remember that L shape, it can go over 1 and then down 2 and then capture my pawn. So I don't want that to happen. So instead, I'm going to move this pawn up 1 space. Now it's the opponent's turn. And with the opponent, if the opponent were to move this pawn 2 spaces forward, now this pawn could take that pawn. For keeping this game simple, I will go ahead and do that. And then white takes pawn. Now it is the opponent's turn. And I want to go ahead and get my bishop out, so I will move the bishop there. Now it is my turn. And if I want to do the same, if I move my bishop here, then this bishop's run on a diagonal line. And so this bishop could go and capture my bishop. But if I do not move this bishop, then this bishop right now is threatening my rook. So you have to decide, what do you want to possibly lose? You could move the bishop here and then possibly lose your bishop. You could move one of your other pieces over here as I knock the pieces over. You can move one of these pieces and possibly lose your rook. You can move your knight up 2 spaces and over 1, but then you might lose the knight to the bishop. Or you can move this pawn up 1 space or move that pawn up 2 spaces. Would you rather lose a pawn, or would you rather lose your bishop, your knight, or your rook? In this case, I would prefer to move my pawn because my pawn is protected by this pawn. So if the bishop were to come down and take my pawn, now this pawn, because you can capture on diagonal only, this pawn will capture my bishop. And since the pawn has captured the bishop, now it is my opponent's turn. And I will move my knight up 2 over 1, but now it's also being threatened by the pawn. Now it's my turn, and I can take the knight, but now my opponent's turn. Their pawn will take my pawn. From here, I'm going to move my queen. Queens can go forward and backwards. They can go side to side as long as there's not a piece right here for them to move. They can also go diagonal. Kings can only move 1 space in any direction except for when you are castling, which I'll explain that here in a few minutes. But for now, I'm going to move my queen up. And now it's my opponent's turn, and I'll move the pawn there. The object of the game is to checkmate your opponent's king. And what that means is no matter what move your opponent does, they cannot move their king without being killed. Therefore, checkmate, the game is over. So now it is my turn over here. I will move pawn, and then I will move this pawn. And then for white, rooks can go up and back, or they can go side to side. So with this, I'll move there. From here, I will move the bishop here and take the pawn. Do you see? The bishop can only go on the diagonal, so it was able to capture my pawn. Now it's my turn. And from here, the bishop is being threatened by my rook, so I could use my rook to take the bishop. Otherwise, if I move something else, the bishop could take my pawn and threaten this bishop, and also threaten my queen. So I am going to go ahead and take the bishop. Now, do you remember that term that I used a moment ago called castling? That's where you can choose a rook and your king, and you can flip-flop spaces just like that. So to show you again, rook, king, and flip-flop. That is about the only time the king can move more than 1 space. As you can see, I have fast-forwarded through the game some. Otherwise, this game can take forever. But if you notice, this king is sitting by himself, so I can move my queen over 1, and because my queen can go forward, I am now threatening the king. This is called check. And at this point, I will have to either move my king out of being in check by the queen. I can block the path with my rook between my queen and my opponent's king. Or my other option is to move my opponent's queen and block my queen from the path of the opponent's queen. So here's where you decide which piece do you want to risk losing. Since I like the queen has more power, being able to go further on the board, I'm going to move the rook. The thing is, if I move the queen to capture the rook, then that queen, then this queen is being threatened by that queen. And so for the moment, I'm going to take this pawn and capture that knight. Now it's my opponent's turn. And my opponent could do something bold like move their rook all the way down here, but then my king will be threatening their rook and could just take the rook. So obviously my opponent does not want to lose their rook. And so my opponent will take their pawn and capture my pawn. As you can see, I have fast forwarded through the game a bit. And now for my opponent can move their queen right here and put my king in check because the queen can go forward and capture my king. So my options are, I could move my bishop up here and block the way, but then the queen can get the bishop. I can move this queen over, again, block the way of the queen, getting my king with my queen. But with either of those scenarios, I will either lose my queen or I will lose my bishop. Or another option is, I can either move my king here, I can move my king there, or I can move my king there to be out of check. So for this game, I am going to move my king from here to here. I am no longer in check. Now it is my opponent's turn. And my opponent could simply move their rook. I'm being threatened by this rook because rooks go forward, so my king cannot move forward. My king cannot move in any of these three spaces because of this queen. The only place my king can go is diagonally backwards. And now I'm out of check. Now it's my opponent's turn. My opponent could move their king, could move the rook, could move the queen, have queen capture queen. And now it's my turn. And from here, I'm limited on what I can do. I can move this rook could take that rook, this rook could move, this pawn can move forward. If pawns make it all the way to the end, then they can become a queen. But for this game, I am just simply going to move my rook and capture the other rook. Now it is my opponent's turn. This pawn cannot move forward because my pawn is blocking that pawn. So my opponent can move this pawn one space forward. It can move their king in any one of these spaces here, or it can move their queen diagonally in either direction or go forward or backwards. For this game, I'm going to move the queen there and threaten the king. But again, I now have my rook here. Rook takes queen. And as you can see, my opponent now has one king and two pawns left. I have two rooks, a bishop, a king, and two pawns. And so from here, my opponent can move the pawn there. I can move the rook there, call the king into check. Now the king can move here, here, or here. The thing is, if the king moves here, then the king could actually take my rook unless I move the rook. So I will move my rook to keep it out of danger. Now it is my opponent's turn, and my opponent is limited on options. It can move its pawn here, but then it's threatened by the bishop and can be taken away, or the king can also move here, 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 here. The only thing is you do not want to move it there because you are in checkmate with the rook and you cannot do that. So instead, I will move my king here and threaten this rook. So now my rook either has to move or the king can take it. So from here, I'm moving my pawn because I'm keeping this game simple. So then my opponent can take my rook. And then from here, I'll move my bishop. My opponent can move its pawn. I will move my pawn. My opponent. The thing is, if my opponent moves its pawn here, then I will be in check and I will have to move my king, or my opponent can also move this king in pretty much any direction it wants from this position. And this pawn obviously is still blocked by my pawn. They're pretty much at a stalemate. And so to keep this game simple and interesting, I will move the pawn here, put my king in check. So now my king has the option to move in front of the pawn, or move beside the pawn, move away from the pawn, or it could simply take the pawn. So to make this simple, I've taken away the threat. Now at this point, my opponent has very few options because this pawn is blocking that pawn, so they're at a stalemate. The only other thing my opponent can do is move their king around. So you could chase each other around the board or call it a game. This setup right here is just to show you what a checkmate would look like. My opponent's king is here, and it is being threatened by my rook here, and my queen. So from here, this king cannot move here because the queen is threatening those squares. It cannot move here because, again, the queen is protecting those squares. And also it cannot move here because of the rook. So the rook here and here, these rooks are threatening those squares. And then the queen is also threatening these squares. The king can do nothing. And so you have a checkmate. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Post them in the comments below. If you liked the video, select thumbs up that you liked it. And as always, please subscribe.